The British Empire's global reach, colonies, conflicts, and lasting legacies. It's late, the kind of late where the world feels quieter than it's supposed to be. Outside, the wind moves through empty streets, brushing against old buildings that have seen more than they ever admit. Somewhere, a clock ticks with unnecessary confidence. And this feels like the right hour to talk about empires, because empires always sound different at night. Less triumphant, more tired, more honest. If you stood on a hill overlooking London sometime in the early 1700s, the city would not yet look like the center of the world. Smoke from coal fires would drift low across the Thames. Ships would crowd the docks, their masts rising like a forest stripped of leaves. Sailors shouted, merchants argued, barrels rolled, deals were made, and promises were broken before breakfast. No one standing there could truly see what was coming, but it was already happening, quietly, piece by piece, map by map. The British Empire did not announce itself with a single conquest or a dramatic declaration. It crept, it negotiated, it traded, it borrowed money it did not yet have, and fought wars it could barely afford. And somehow, through a mix of timing, luck, violence, and paperwork, it became the largest empire the world has ever known. An empire on which, as the saying went, the sun never set. Mostly because it owned places everywhere the sun bothered to rise. This is not a story of pure villainy or pure progress. It never is. It's a story of ambition meeting opportunity, of ideals colliding with reality, of power spreading faster than wisdom. And it's a story whose echoes still linger in accents, borders, legal systems, and unresolved arguments that refuse to stay buried. So settle in. This is a long one. History tends to be. Long before Britain ruled anything beyond its own damp green fields, it was a relatively minor player on the edge of Europe, an island with impressive sheep, unpredictable weather, and an almost heroic talent for internal conflict. For centuries, England's primary concern had been survival, surviving invasions, surviving plagues, surviving itself. But by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, something had shifted. Europe had discovered the ocean again, and this time it was serious about it. Spain and Portugal were already carving up the world with alarming confidence. Gold flowed in from the Americas, spices arrived from the East, entire continents were being reimagined as commercial opportunities. England, watching all this from across the channel, felt something deeply unsettling: jealousy. England's early ventures overseas were tentative, often chaotic, and occasionally embarrassing. Explorers like John Cabot sailed west under the English flag and found fish, a lot of fish. Newfoundland was not exactly the glittering prize Spain was pulling from Mexico, but it was a start. More importantly, it planted an idea. Maybe England didn't need vast armies. Maybe it didn't need cathedrals plated in gold. Maybe it just needed ships, patience, and a willingness to take risks that felt unreasonable at the time. Then came the privateers. Officially, they were entrepreneurs. Unofficially, they were pirates with better paperwork. Men like Francis Drake sailed under royal approval, attacking Spanish ships, stealing treasure, and returning home as heroes. Spain complained, of course. England shrugged. This blend of legality and theft would become something of a tradition. The real turning point, though, came not with conquest, but with commerce. In 1600, a group of merchants received a royal charter to form the East India Company. It sounded harmless enough. Trade with Asia, spices, silk, tea. No one, at least officially, was talking about ruling millions of people. That part came later, much later, and then all at once. At first, the British presence in India was modest. Trading posts along the coast, forts built more for protection than domination. The Mughal Empire still ruled, vast and wealthy, its courts glittering with power. The British were guests, sometimes annoying ones, sometimes useful ones, rarely respected ones. But empires have a way of sensing weakness. the way sharks sense blood. As Mughal authority began to fracture in the 18th century, the East India Company stepped in, offering military support to local rulers in exchange for trading privileges, then more privileges, then territory, then control. And before anyone quite realized what had happened, a private company had become the ruler of one of the richest regions on Earth. This is where the British Empire becomes truly strange. It was not initially built by the state, but by corporations, profit-driven entities with armies, tax systems, and their own foreign policies. Imagine a modern company doing that today. Now imagine it succeeding. That was India under company rule. Back in Britain, most people had a vague idea of what was happening. They knew tea was cheaper, they knew cotton was abundant, they knew wealth was flowing in, and that seemed sufficient. The details were far away, and distant suffering has always been easier to ignore. Across the Atlantic, another experiment was unfolding. The British colonies in North America began as fragile settlements clinging to survival. Jamestown nearly collapsed. Plymouth struggled through brutal winters. These were not glamorous places. They were muddy, hungry, and deeply uncertain. But the colonies grew, slowly at first, then faster. Land was taken, treaties were signed and broken, indigenous populations were displaced with a mixture of violence and polite excuses. British settlers built farms, towns, and assemblies that looked increasingly independent, which, as it turned out, was a problem. Britain's wars with France in the 18th century were global affairs. They fought in Europe, in India, in the Caribbean, and in North America. When Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War in 1763, it controlled more territory than ever before. It also controlled more debt than ever before, and someone, unfortunately, had to pay for it. The solution, from London's perspective, was obvious: tax the colonies. From the colonies' perspective, it was outrageous. No representation in Parliament, yet expected to fund imperial wars. The arguments escalated, the rhetoric sharpened, and eventually the unthinkable happened. The American colonies rebelled. For Britain, the American Revolution was shocking, humiliating, and deeply confusing. How could fellow Britons, loyal subjects, reject the empire so completely? How could a collection of colonies defeat the most powerful navy in the world? The answer, as usual, was complicated. Distance mattered, French support mattered, British overconfidence mattered. A great many things mattered all at once. When the war ended in 1783, Britain lost its most prominent settler colonies. It felt, for a moment, like the beginning of the end. It wasn't. In many ways, it was a beginning of something colder, more efficient, and far more global. If North America was gone, Britain would look elsewhere, to India more aggressively, to Africa more systematically, to Australia, which conveniently existed and was very far away. Australia began as a prison, literally. Britain needed somewhere to send its convicts now that America was no longer an option. So ships sailed south, carrying people who had stolen bread, forged documents, or simply annoyed the wrong authorities. They arrived on unfamiliar shores, where indigenous societies had lived for tens of thousands of years. Those societies would not survive contact with empire intact. By the early 19th century, Britain was no longer just expanding, it was organizing. Railways were laid, bureaucracies grew, maps became more precise, time zones were standardized. The empire learned to measure, classify, and control on an industrial scale. And then came the Age of Confidence, the Victorian era, the belief that the empire was not just powerful, but righteous, that it brought civilization, order, and progress wherever it went. This belief was repeated often enough that many came to accept it, even as evidence piled up to the contrary. India was drained of wealth. Famines occurred under imperial administration, worsened by rigid economic policies. In Ireland, another part of the empire much closer to home, millions starved during the Great Famine, while food continued to be exported. The empire was efficient, yes, but efficiency does not care who it harms. By the late 19th century, Britain controlled vast territories in Africa. Borders were drawn with rulers and pencils, ignoring languages, cultures, and histories. These lines would outlast the empire itself, causing problems long after the British flag was lowered. And still, at its height, the empire seemed unstoppable. British ships ruled the seas. British goods filled markets worldwide. British law shaped courts from Canada to India. English became the language of administration, trade, and aspiration. But empires, like knights, eventually grow tired. The First World War cracked the illusion of invincibility. The Second shattered it. Britain emerged victorious, but exhausted, economically strained, and increasingly unable to justify imperial rule to a world that had seen too much. One by one, colonies demanded independence. India in 1947, Africa in waves throughout the 1950s and 60s. Some transitions were negotiated, others were violent. All were complicated, none left without scars. And yet, the empire never fully disappeared. Its legacies remain in parliamentary systems, in legal codes, in railways still in use, in conflicts still unresolved, in debates about identity, responsibility, and memory. Tonight, as the world grows quieter, it's worth remembering that the British Empire was not just something that happened, it is something that is still happening in quieter ways, in inherited structures, in the shape of the modern world. And we're only just getting started. Commerce, cannons, and the confidence of control. The strange thing about empires is that they rarely notice when they've crossed the line between expansion and overreach. There's no trumpet blast, no official announcement, just a gradual shift in tone. Confidence hardens into certainty, certainty drifts into entitlement, and entitlement, given enough time and enough power, starts to believe it's immortal. By the early 19th century, Britain stood at the center of a global system that seemed, at least from London, perfectly logical. Raw materials flowed in from colonies. Manufactured goods flowed back out. Trade routes were protected by the Royal Navy, whose ships patrolled the oceans with methodical patience. It was an empire built not only on conquest, but on schedules, on shipping timetables, on paperwork, on the quiet assumption that this was simply how the world worked now. At 2 in the morning, though, that kind of certainty feels fragile, like a house that looks solid in daylight but creaks when the wind picks up. India remained the jewel in the imperial crown, though by this point the crown was beginning to feel heavy. The East India Company ruled vast territories, collected taxes from millions, and maintained an army larger than that of many European states. And yet, it was still, on paper, a company. A board of directors in London made decisions that shaped the lives of farmers in Bengal and traders in Delhi, often without understanding or curiosity. Profit was the language everyone shared. Everything else was translation. The British justified their presence in India with a familiar script. They spoke of stability, modernization, and the rule of law. Railways were built, telegraph lines stretched across the subcontinent, universities taught English literature and British philosophy. All of it was presented as progress, and in some ways it was. But progress under empire came with conditions. It served the system first, the people second, if at all. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, and in 1857 it exploded. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the Sepoy Mutiny in British records, was not a single uprising, but a cascade of anger, fear, and betrayal. Indian soldiers in the company's army rebelled, triggered in part by new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat, offensive to religious beliefs. That detail mattered, but it wasn't the whole story. The cartridges were a spark. The fire had been building for years. The rebellion spread. Cities fell. British families were killed. Retaliation was swift and brutal. Villages were destroyed. Executions were public and merciless. The empire responded as empires often do when frightened, with overwhelming force and moral certainty. When the violence ended, the East India Company was dissolved. Britain took direct control of India. The Crown stepped in, promising reform, fairness, and restraint. The British Raj was born. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, though she never set foot there. It was empire at a distance, formalized and sanitized for domestic audiences back home. Elsewhere, the empire expanded with similar confidence. In Africa, British involvement deepened through a mix of trade, missionary activity, and military intervention. The justification was often framed as humanitarian, ending slavery, bringing Christianity, introducing order. These goals were sincerely believed by some and cynically exploited by others. The results were rarely as noble as the rhetoric. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century was a frenzy of European ambition. Borders were drawn in conference rooms thousands of miles away from the lands that divided. Rivers became boundaries. Straight lines cut through ethnic groups and ecosystems. Britain acquired territories from Egypt to South Africa, linking them in imperial imagination, if not always in reality. In southern Africa, conflict followed conquest. The Zulu kingdom resisted fiercely. The Boer Wars pitted Britain against Dutch-descended settlers who did not appreciate being absorbed into someone else's empire. The wars were brutal, modern, and deeply revealing. Concentration camps were used. Civilian suffering was widespread. The empire won, but at a cost that unsettled even some of its supporters. Back in Britain, these events were often filtered through newspapers that celebrated victories and minimized discomfort. The empire was marketed as an adventure, a civilizing mission, a burden borne willingly by a noble power. This narrative was comforting. It allowed people to sleep at night. But cracks were forming. In Ireland, centuries of British rule had produced resentment, rebellion, and resistance that refused to fade. The Great Famine of the 1840s left scars that never healed. Millions died or emigrated, while the empire debated policy. Irish nationalism grew louder, more organized, more dangerous to imperial stability. Ireland was not a distant colony. It was uncomfortably close, and it did not behave as empire expected. Across the oceans, settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand followed a different path. These societies were granted increasing self-government. They were British, but not quite subordinate. White, English-speaking, and culturally familiar, they were trusted with autonomy denied elsewhere. This selective generosity revealed the racial hierarchies embedded deep within imperial thinking, whether acknowledged or not. The empire was not a single experience. It was many empires layered on top of each other. Benevolent in some places, exploitative in others, violent almost everywhere if you looked closely enough. As the 19th century faded into the 20th, the empire faced a new kind of challenge. Not rebellion with muskets, but ideas. Nationalism, self-determination, the belief that people should govern themselves, not be managed from afar. These ideas had helped dismantle other empires. Britain, ironically, had helped spread them through its education systems and political philosophy, as if that could ever go wrong. World War I accelerated everything. Britain fought to preserve balance in Europe and emerged victorious, but deeply shaken. Millions were dead. The economy was strained. The moral authority of empire felt thinner. Colonial troops had fought and died for the empire. They returned home with questions, expectations, demands. Between the wars, unrest grew. In India, figures like Gandhi promoted non-violent resistance that embarrassed the empire more effectively than armed rebellion ever could. Peaceful protests, boycotts, and hunger strikes made imperial authority look clumsy and cruel. It is difficult to justify domination when your opponent refuses to fight the way you expect. Then came World War II, a war that Britain survived, but only just. Cities burned, resources were exhausted. The empire helped win the war, but it could no longer pretend to be eternal. The world had changed too much. The night was too long. The cost too high. When the war ended, the empire began to unravel with surprising speed. India gained independence in 1947, though partition brought violence and displacement on a horrifying scale. Elsewhere, independence movements surged. Some transitions were peaceful, others descended into conflict. The empire tried to manage its exit, to control the narrative. Sometimes it succeeded, often it did not. And yet, even as territories slipped away, Britain retained influence through trade, through language, through institutions that outlasted flags and governors. The empire was shrinking, but its shadow remained long. In the quiet hours of the night, it's tempting to see the British Empire as a single story, with a clear beginning and end. But it's more like a series of overlapping echoes. Decisions made centuries ago still ripple through modern politics, borders, and identities. The long goodbye. Decolonization, memory, and unfinished business. By the time the sun rose on the post-war world, the British Empire was already running on habit rather than belief. It still existed on maps, flags still flew, governors still signed documents with careful, looping handwriting. But something essential had changed. The certainty was gone. The quiet confidence that had once justified everything no longer survived daylight. After 1945, the word empire began to sound old-fashioned, slightly embarrassing, like a term from a previous century that no longer fit the furniture of the modern world. The war had rewritten the rules. Europe lay damaged and exhausted. New superpowers watched impatiently from across the Atlantic and deep inside Eurasia. And everywhere Britain looked, colonies were asking the same inconvenient question: why not now? India's independence was the moment when the empire truly realized the night was ending, not because Britain wanted it to end that way, but because India was too large, too central, too symbolic to lose quietly. The negotiations were hurried. The lines were drawn too fast. The consequences were catastrophic. Partition split communities, families, and histories apart in a matter of weeks. Millions moved. Hundreds of thousands died. Independence arrived, wrapped in grief. From London, it was framed as an orderly transfer of power. From the ground, it felt like chaos. This would become a pattern. Across Asia, Britain retreated unevenly. Burma gained independence. Malaya followed after years of emergency rule and guerrilla warfare. In the Middle East, the legacy was even messier. British mandates in Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan left behind borders that looked tidy on paper and proved explosive in reality. The empire exited, but its handwriting remained on the walls. Africa's turn came next. Ghana led the way in 1957, its independence celebrated with optimism and hope. Others followed: Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. Each departure came with its own negotiations, compromises, and tensions. Sometimes independence was welcomed by Britain as inevitable. Other times it was resisted fiercely, especially when economic interests or strategic locations were involved. Kenya's Mau Mau uprising revealed how far Britain would still go to preserve control. Detention camps, collective punishment, and brutal counterinsurgency tactics exposed a side of imperial authority that clashed sharply with Britain's self-image as civilized, restrained power. Years later, documents would surface. Apologies would be issued, but the damage, like most imperial damage, could not be undone by acknowledgement alone. By the 1960s, the empire was unraveling faster than it could be neatly folded away. Flags were lowered, new national anthems played. British administrators packed their files and left behind systems that were meant to function without them. Sometimes they did, often they didn't. Corruption, instability, and conflict followed in many places, not because independence was a mistake, but because empire had never prepared its subjects to rule on equal terms. It's tempting to frame this period as a clean ending. Britain leaves, new nations emerge, history moves on. But history rarely cooperates with tidy narratives. The legacy of empire lived on in language. English became the bridge between hundreds of cultures, sometimes uniting, sometimes flattening. It lived on in law, where British legal frameworks shaped courts from Delhi to Lagos. It lived on in economics, where trade relationships often continued to favor the former imperial center. And it lived on in memory, where interpretations of the empire diverged sharply, depending on where you stood. In Britain itself, memory became selective. The empire was remembered as an era of exploration and influence, of railways and institutions, of spreading ideas that supposedly improved the world. The violence, the famines, the exploitation were acknowledged occasionally, usually quietly, often defensively. Statues remained, street names persisted, museums displayed artifacts without always explaining how they were acquired. Elsewhere, the empire was remembered differently, as occupation, as extraction, as interruption, as a force that reshaped societies in ways still being negotiated today. These memories did not fade simply because flags changed. The Commonwealth emerged as a softer echo of empire, a network of former colonies linked by history, language, and occasional nostalgia. For some, it offered cooperation and connection. For others, it felt like a reminder of a relationship that had never been equal. Britain promoted it as partnership. Not everyone agreed. And then there was the question of identity. Britain itself had been shaped by empire. Its wealth, its diversity, its cities, and its cuisine all carried traces of colonial history. Immigration from former colonies transformed British society in the post-war years, bringing cultures once ruled from afar into the heart of the former empire. This, too, was part of the legacy, though it was not always welcomed. Debates over empire became debates over responsibility. Should Britain apologize? Should it offer reparations? Should it remove monuments or reinterpret them? These questions resurfaced again and again, often late at night, often unresolved. The past refused to stay quiet. What makes the British Empire particularly unsettling to reflect on is how ordinary it all felt at the time. It was not built by villains twirling mustaches, but by clerks, officers, merchants, and politicians who believed they were doing something reasonable, necessary, even good. That belief, more than cruelty alone, is what gave the empire its endurance. At 2 a.m, that's the part that lingers, the realization that systems can cause immense harm without dramatic malice, that paperwork can be as powerful as cannons, that history is shaped as much by boredom and routine as by ambition and violence. The British Empire is gone, officially, but its outlines still shape the world, in borders that don't quite make sense, in conflicts that trace their origins to hurried decisions, in shared languages that connect people who were never meant to meet, in arguments about history that are really arguments about the present. As the night deepens, it becomes clear that empires do not end when they collapse. They end slowly, unevenly, and never completely. They fade into institutions, habits, and assumptions that take generations to unlearn. After the empire, echoes, myths, and the shape of the modern world. By the time an empire becomes a subject for documentaries, it has already begun its second life. The first life is made of decisions, battles, and ledgers. The second is made of stories. And stories, especially the ones told late at night, have a way of smoothing sharp edges, rounding off uncomfortable truths, and lingering longer than facts ever do. The British Empire's second life began quietly. There was no ceremony for it, no final curtain call, just a gradual shift from rule to remembrance, from governors to historians, from orders to opinions. In Britain, the empire became something people talked about in fragments: a grandparent's service overseas, a photograph in uniform, a railway station built somewhere far away. The violence rarely made it into these conversations. The famines were footnotes. The rebellions were complications. The empire, as remembered, was efficient, orderly, and strangely polite. At 2 in the morning, this version of the story feels suspiciously tidy. Because outside Britain, the memory of empire refused to cooperate. In India, debates over colonial impact filled classrooms and politics alike. Some argued that British rule introduced modern institutions. Others pointed out that those institutions were designed to serve imperial needs first. Both were true, and that was the problem. Empire left behind contradictions, not conclusions. In Africa, colonial borders continued to influence conflict and cooperation. Nations inherited political systems that had never been meant to represent them. Economies shaped around extraction struggled to reinvent themselves. Leaders who had fought for independence now had to govern states assembled by foreign logic. The empire had left, the puzzle remained. Even in places where British rule had been less overtly violent, the psychological imprint endured. Language shaped education, legal systems shaped justice. Ideas about governance carried assumptions that were not always compatible with local realities. Empire had not just occupied land, it had occupied imagination. And yet, it would be dishonest to pretend that everything left behind was ruin. That kind of storytelling is comforting in its simplicity, but history resists it. Railways did connect regions. Legal frameworks did offer stability in some contexts. English did become a shared language that allowed global communication. The tragedy of empire is not that it did nothing useful. It's that whatever it did was inseparable from what it took. This ambiguity makes the British Empire especially difficult to talk about. It does not fit neatly into moral categories. It was neither a purely civilizing mission nor a simple story of exploitation. It was both, often at the same time, often in the same place, sometimes carried out by the same people before lunch. As Britain adjusted to its post-imperial identity, it struggled with scale. The empire had once provided purpose, confidence, and a sense of global importance. Without it, Britain had to renegotiate its place in the world. It joined alliances, it leaned into diplomacy, it told itself new stories about leadership and influence. But the absence was noticeable, like an echo fading slowly in a large room. This is where nostalgia enters, not the loud kind, but the quiet, persistent kind. The idea that things were once simpler, that Britain mattered more, that the empire, for all its flaws, gave the country direction. Nostalgia does not ask permission from history, it edits freely. For former colonies, nostalgia worked differently. It sometimes attached itself to stability or to the predictability of systems imposed from outside. This was not affection for empire itself, but for moments of certainty in otherwise turbulent histories. Even this nostalgia was complicated, often uncomfortable to admit. The British Empire also left behind something harder to see but deeply influential: a global framework of power relationships, financial systems, trade routes, diplomatic habits. Many of today's international institutions carry traces of imperial thinking, even when they speak the language of cooperation and equality. At night, when the world slows down, it becomes easier to see how deeply the past reaches into the present, how arguments about borders, governance, and identity often lead back, eventually, to imperial decisions made by people who assumed their choices would last forever. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the British Empire is this: it taught the world how to think globally, while rarely considering the consequences of doing so without empathy. It connected continents, then struggled with the responsibility that connection demanded. The empire believed in order, in rules, in systems that could manage complexity from afar. What it underestimated was human memory, the way stories are passed down, the way injustice lingers even when laws change. the way silence can become its own form of inheritance. As this long night of history begins to wind down, the British Empire feels less like a monument and more like a shadow, present not because it is admired, but because light keeps catching its outline, in politics and culture, in the way the modern world still negotiates power and belonging. The story does not end with independence or withdrawal. It ends, if it ends at all, in reflection, in the willingness to sit with discomfort, to accept that the past cannot be simplified without losing something essential. In the final moments, we'll step back even further, away from dates and territories, towards something quieter. A closing thought on empires themselves, why they rise, why they fall, and why, long after they're gone, they still keep us awake. When the sun finally sets, there is a particular kind of quiet that arrives just before morning. Not quite night anymore, but not yet day. The world pauses there, suspended between what was and what will be. It feels like the right place to leave an empire. The British Empire did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. There was no final battle that ended it, no palace stormed, no capital burning in flames visible from space. Instead, it thinned, it retreated, it let go, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with relief, like an old structure that no longer trusted its own foundations. At its height, the empire covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed hundreds of millions of people. Those numbers are staggering in daylight. At night, they feel abstract. What lingers instead are the human details. A clerk stamping documents in Calcutta, a soldier staring across unfamiliar terrain in Kenya, a farmer in Ireland watching ships leave a harbor full of food, a student learning a language that was never meant to replace their own. Empires are built from moments like these, ordinary moments, repeated often enough across enough distance that they become systems. And systems, once in motion, are difficult to stop, even when the people inside them begin to doubt. The British Empire believed deeply in progress, in rationality, in the idea that the world could be improved through order and administration. These beliefs were not invented to justify conquest, but they became convenient tools for it. Railways were built to move goods and troops. Laws were written to simplify governance. Education was offered in ways that shaped loyalty as much as intellect. What the empire never fully acknowledged was the cost of imposing its version of order on places that already had their own. It mistook difference for disorder, complexity for chaos, and in doing so, it replaced one set of problems with another, often larger and longer lasting. When independence came, it did not arrive on equal terms. New nations inherited systems designed to serve someone else's priorities. They were expected to function immediately, efficiently, and peacefully, as if history had not just happened to them, as if centuries of extraction, division, and control could be shrugged off with a new flag and an anthem. And yet, something remarkable happened. People adapted, cultures endured, new identities formed from the fragments left behind. The empire underestimated this too. It underestimated the resilience of those it ruled. For Britain, the end of empire required a different kind of adjustment, learning to exist without automatic authority, learning to listen instead of direct, learning that influence, once enforced, now had to be negotiated. This transition was awkward. It still is. The echo of empire lingers in politics, in foreign policy, in the way Britain sometimes imagines its own role in the world. History textbooks often ask whether the British Empire was good or bad. This is a question that sounds useful until you sit with it for too long. Empires are not moral arguments. They are processes. They create winners and losers, often the same people at different times. They offer infrastructure and inflict trauma. They leave behind both connection and fracture. The more honest question might be this: What do we do with the inheritance? The world shaped by the British Empire is interconnected in ways that cannot be undone. Languages overlap. Legal systems resemble one another. Trade routes follow old imperial lines. So do conflicts. So do inequalities. None of this can be erased without erasing the people who live within it. But history is not only a record of harm. It is also a record of learning, of recognizing patterns, of understanding that power exercised without humility rarely ends well. The British Empire is not unique in this lesson. It is simply one of the clearest examples, preserved in detail, still close enough to feel personal. As the night finally loosens its grip, the empire becomes what all empires eventually become: a warning, a reference point, a reminder that no system, no matter how vast, is permanent, that control has limits, that the world resists being managed forever. The sun did set on the British Empire, not all at once, not evenly, but it set. And in its fading light, it left behind a world still negotiating what that meant. If there is comfort to be found in this story, it is a quiet one. Empires end, people continue. Memory argues with myth, and history, when told slowly and honestly, has a way of softening certainty and sharpening empathy. So as this long night of history draws to a close, let the empire rest where it belongs, not glorified, not erased, but understood, in all its reach, its contradictions, and its lasting shadows. And now, with the last word spoken, the room grows quieter. The clocks keep ticking. The world waits for morning.